And I know we have a live stream. We are going to be preferencing in-person participation, but if we can, we will get to questions and comments from the live stream. And I will kind of moderate after I give the introduction and once Danny starts speaking. Okay, let me get my remarks. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, I took Moïse Pistone's last ever seminar on Das Kapital. One day in class, a graduate student raised her hand and asked, "Professor Pistone, why didn't Marx believe the capitalists were the revolutionary class? If the capitalists hold all the capital, shouldn't they just make socialism happen?" Moïse smiled knowingly and responded, "The reproduction of capital happens behind the backs of the actors. We live under the social domination of capital." Concurrently with the class, I was also attending the Platypus reading group. I imagined Lenin sitting next to me and politely interjecting to point out that the capitalists are not politically incentivized to organize as a revolutionary class. To introduce Danny's study of Das Kapital, I would like to address the question, of what interest is the critique of political economy to a student of Platypus? As I hope the anecdote begins to illustrate, political economy is a form that the theory-practice problem has taken in history. Political economy conceives of itself as both a science capable of describing the objective laws of modern society and a political practice capable of changing that society. Marx's imminent dialectical critique of political economy shows where it fails to fulfill this desiderata. The iron law of wages, or Malthus's theory of overpopulation, naturalize processes which are rooted in human activity. Marx, emphasizing the objective side of this phenomenon, called this the commodity fetish. Lukács, much later, emphasizing the subjective side of this phenomenon, called it reification. For Marx, the pursuit by the proletariat of its bourgeois right and its iron belief in the commodity form leads through the contradictions and antagonisms of the capitalist mode of production to the necessity of the political struggle, in which the proletariat must assert the political economy of the working class against the political economy of the bourgeoisie. Political economy, as the politics of the working class in Marx's time, is a self-consciousness of this process, which must be criticized and overcome. Today, Das Kapital is usually thought of as a way to understand Marx's theory, and in the recession of leftist activism that we are currently experiencing, leftist Das Kapital reading groups have become a lucrative new market. Michael Heinrich's most recent book, How to Read Capital, promises to explain the mechanics of the book to new readers. In the introduction, Heinrich tells readers that, quote, Marx's intent is to examine the fundamental laws of capitalism. Marx aims to depict what he calls at the end of the third volume, the ideal average of the capitalist mode of production. He is concerned with what makes capitalism, capitalism, end quote. Heinrich promises that this description of capitalism will still be relevant to understanding the workings of capitalism in the 21st century, so that you can oppose and change them. Eager readers will hope that Das Kapital shows them how the world works and how it can be changed, that it provides an actionable theory of the present. In Marginalia to Theory and Praxis, Theodor Adorno comments on the theoretical character of Marx's writings on political economy. Quote, and this will be a lengthy quote, "The relationship between theory and practice, after both have once distanced themselves from each other, is that of qualitative reversal, not transition, and surely not subordination. They stand in a polar relationship. The theory that is not conceived as an instruction for its realization should have the most hope for realization, analogous to what occurred in the natural sciences between atomic theory and nuclear fission. What they had in common, the backtracking to a possible praxis, lay in the technologically oriented reason in itself, not in any thoughts about application. The Marxist doctrine of the unity of theory and praxis was no doubt credible because of the presentiment that it could be too late, that it was now or never. To that extent, it was certainly practical. But the theory as it is actually explicated, the critique of political economy, lacks all concrete transitions to that praxis that, according to the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, should constitute its raison d'etre. Marx's reticence concerning theoretical recipes for praxis was hardly less than that concerning a positive description of a classless society. Capital contains numerous invectives, most often against economists and philosophers, but no program for action. Every speaker of the APO who has learned his vocabulary would have to chide that book for being abstract. The theory of surplus value does not tell how one should start a revolution in regard to praxis generally, not in specific political questions. The anti-philosophical Marx hardly moves beyond the philosophy that only the proletariat itself can be the cause of its emancipation. And at that time, the proletariat was still visible. That's Theodor Adorno from Martinelli's Theory of Praxis. Heinrich and others would have us think that the polemics against political economists that riddle the pages of Das Kapital and maniacally unfold in endless footnotes exist for the sole purpose of explaining economic formulas, formulas that can be applied to contemporary politics to guide action. As Adorno indicates, the Marxist critique of political economy pointed beyond the existing forms of practice, and therefore theory, in Marx's time, a criticism made possible by the experience and failure of the 1848 revolutions. Already in the time of the Second International, political economy had become impossible, and Marxists began to argue over the meaning of the critique of political economy. For the Second International radicals, and I have in mind here Lenin and Luxemburg in particular, the rise of imperialism was an advance and transformation of the problem of political economy, motivating Rosa Luxemburg to write The Accumulation of Capital. The politics and organization of the proletariat had transformed as a result of Marx's political intervention in the First International and the founding of the Second International mass parties, and so had the conditions of theory. In the Revolution of 1917, the Marxist doctrine of the unity of theory and praxis was supposed to be fulfilled. And it was in the failure of the 1917 revolution that Karl Korsch observed that the umbilical cord between theory and praxis had been severed. In summer of 2020, Platypus led a reading group on the works of Karl Kautsky. At that time, we asked ourselves, what in the writings of Kautsky and his description of the Socialist Party was historically specific, and what might constitute something of a method or principle? A reading of Das Kapital should be animated by similar questions. Why did Marx write Capital? What role did it serve in its time, and why did it become such an important book for the Marxists of the Second International, or even for the New Left? The New Left reached to Das Kapital out of dissatisfaction with the theory and praxis of their time. Moishe Pistone found that Das Kapital criticized the left's focus on redistribution by showing that the demand for labor and even for wages intensified the problems and contradictions of capitalism. At the same time, the New Left appropriation of Das Kapital against the Second International is problematic, and we live with its legacy today. In a recent debate hosted by Platypus, Andrew Arado commented that Lenin was, first and foremost, a great strategist and not a great theoretician. Nothing Lenin wrote seems to match the theoretical monumentality of Das Kapital. But one cannot jump over the problem of the 1917 revolution and use Das Kapital to understand the failures of the left and the theoretical problems facing the left today. The 1917 revolution and its failure is not reducible to the critique of political economy. It was the potential to overcome the critique of political economy. And in the wake of its failure, the left is tasked with learning from defeat in a new way. The subsequent liquidation of the party has forestalled this learning for 100 years and threatens to forestall it indefinitely. Das Kapital cannot suffice to meet this task, and an attempt to make it a cure-all theoretical solution to capitalism reduces it to vulgar bourgeois economics. Platypus contends that the unique condition of our time is the death of the left. Maybe Marx had it too easy. As Adorno remarks, in his time, the proletariat was still visible. For Platypus, the critique of political economy illuminates, above all else, the conditions of possibility for theory and praxis that are absent in the present. It is a guide to what is not, much more than to what is. I'll hand it over to Danny.
Just stand there where you want to. I'm sure this fits.
Okay. This is going to be a little autobiographical because this is actually kind of how I joined Platypus, like in a very indirect way. I kind of came to it. So, approaching a Das Kapital teaching is highly fraught. The speaker immediately throws themselves into a crossfire of the century of debate. I want to give an autobiography to get at what I believe to be something that has fallen out in modern discussions about Marx's critique of political economy, using myself as an object of critique. And actually, as a side, if you want to interrupt at any time, feel free as well. What does that mean or something like that? I'm not going to solve the transformation problem, prove the tendency of the rate of profit logically or empirically, the problem of accumulation in volume 2, the correctness or incorrectness of Okashi's theorem, the challenge of the economic calculation of socialist Conworth, all of this stuff, all of this, century of, scholarship on this kind of thing. Ultimately, the audience, and maybe people don't want to hear this, will have to read through the volumes on their own, and I do not doubt there are plenty of competent readers here. When I was an undergrad at Temple University, my first interaction with Marx's Capital was to approach it as kind of like the most complete description of the world that I was living in. I was a very nerdy undergrad, so I had actually read Keynes's General Theory, and I had read Hayek, and I had read von Mises's Human Action before I had ever read Capital. So by the time I was reading it, I was like, is this right? Is this wrong? There's a logical fallacy, this kind of thing. I did not doubt that there had been some kind of empirical change since Marx's time, but the laws that he gave, I saw it as a kind of counterweight, and actually since we're at GMU, this is apropos, to von Mises's Human Action, meaning he said this, but Marx said this, like I was a bourgeois apologist. I read the text polemically. I read it with an emphasis on explaining why capitalism was liable to fall into crisis. So for a millennial, I was shocked by the housing bubble and the financial crisis. And so Capital was kind of back in vogue. It was in the Wall Street Journal, like, oh, Wall Street investors are reading it again. Das Kapital did more than simply explain why a depression had happened, but rather pointed to the immanent possibility of overcoming the barrier itself. The diminishing portion of living labor, so people's activity itself, added to the product, implied that human work could be abolished. And so I was working at a Bed Bath and Beyond at the time, and it was kind of like, okay, this is a ridiculous job and we're in a depression, so Capital seemed to fit very nicely in the whole thing. But there was some problem I had in terms of reading the text that I could never get quite around, which is this question of labor. Like, he's talking about labor, he's saying labor, labor, and I would be told by more veteran kind of leftists who had read it, they'd go, it works in the text, right? Just deal with it. Like, don't think about it too much. It works. You got to read through the whole thing and then it will make sense. And, I kind of thought that appealed to the totality, but I still couldn't explain why is he talking about labor this entire time. And so I would think of all of these, criticisms. I would say, well, what if it's a mud pie, right? This is like a famous argument. Certainly all the labor in the world could not make something valuable. And so, these kind of older leftists would say to me, well, but Marx notes that the commodity has to be useful, so that's a refutation to this, bourgeois kind of criticism. And then I would think, so why is something not more valuable the longer it takes, right? If it's labor time, then the more labor, it should be more valuable. And then they would say, well, it's socially necessary labor time. So they just kind of appeal to the text, right? These kind of things that Marx was talking about in volume 1. And then I'd be like, what is socially necessary labor time? And they would say, well, that's what's considered necessary by society. In other words, they would say, what is valuable is that which is valuable, right? It's just a circular kind of argument. So I was really frustrated by all of this. And I kept kind of looking around. And, I would keep asking people, and they would say, well, it's not Marx's theory, it's Adam Smith or Ricardo's theory. And Marx just kind of takes it and he shows the implication of it. This is the critique of political economy. And, then I thought, like, okay, but what if Adam Smith and Ricardo are just wrong? Then it's just kind of folly and you're just kind of playing around with somebody's wrong theory and showing all sorts of things like that. And so I would keep reading, and, you know, I would see further criticisms, maybe its utility, you know, it's kind of circular. I read something funny about, well, why is it a labor theory of value? Why isn't it a sun theory of value, right? Because everything comes from the sun ultimately. It's like, you know, and people, you know, just like this is crazy shit I would find, you know, as a young undergrad on the internet. And so I just kept kind of, you know, walking around and like looking for this. And in retrospect, now looking back at it, what I was trying to do is figure out how to justify the text in the present. And I was having a lot of trouble doing that. And maybe that actually ends up being, you know, the kind of positive aspect of me being really confused about a lot of things. So I knew that Marx, according to his own words, had taken the postulates of political economy on their own basis and shown the limits of labor as value. It was strange to me, you know, because this was kind of popular at the time to hear Marxist economists. They were all of a sudden on like kind of RT, like they wouldn't get on CNN probably, but they'd be on like, you know, this kind of news, the real news, and they were like, you know, I don't know, Richard Wolff or something like, well, Marx already explained all of this in his text, you know, 150 years ago, and we got to go and read that. And I was kind of confused because I was like, but isn't it supposed to be a critique of why like these categories are like wrong? And then I would hear the Marxist economists go like, well, this explains everything. And so I was like just totally befuddled and still sad, right, working at Bed Bath & Beyond. So it was around this time actually, and you can find this on the internet, it's embarrassing to me. I had a conversation with Chris Guttrum, founder of Platypus, and it, you know, kind of gave me an epiphany. So Chris spoke on RT television. It's a great kind of like panel. It's like Chris is in a suit and there's like two other economists. And I was not in Platypus at the time. And I wrote on, you know, Chris's Facebook wall, because I had, you know, still trying to get under this while pretending like I knew what I was kind of talking about. I said, well, you know, Chris, Marx critiqued the categories of political economy, the very manner in which the political economists cognized the reality, because he knew that since these categories were socially objective, dialectically subjective and objective, and edit that in, that the demonstration of the theoretical crisis would translate into practice and hopefully change. So this is my response to this interview. And Chris wrote back to me, he said, well, political economy was objective for Marx, or quote objective, a Smithian Ricardian conception, because it was the dominant form of appearance to the workers in their struggle for wages against capital. It isn't today because that struggle doesn't exist with the same acuity it did then. So I was a little frustrated with the response, and I responded. I said, well, but then if there was going to be a return to any kind of Marxist critique of political economy, and I'm saying like, I want to do that. And I said, by that, I mean an immanent critique of contemporary categories. So I was looking at the other economists that were on the panel with Chris, and I was like, you know, Chris, you got to immanently critique them. This is what you got to do, kind of thing. I said, you know, then what would that look like, or can we even know? And Chris responded, well, Danny, part of the problem is that without a form of political practice to manifest the issue of capitalism, theory is left as mere methodology rather than proper self-consciousness, critical recognition. So it's not a matter of proper methodology, but rather that the forms of appearances, practices are lacking, I think. So around this time that Chris said this to me, I had just read Karl Korsch's Marxism of the First International. So if you're in the fall syllabus right now, you'll be reading it in, say, a month or two. Korsch, keeping with his theme at the time of that writing of the unity of theory and praxis, Aaron just talked about this, characterized Das Kapital as the theoretical expression of the proletarian socialist movement. Remember, Marx had already published his contribution. So in a sense, he had already given a critique of political economy. You can already also find it in The Poverty of Philosophy. And yet he's led to publish Capital during the First International, during the Civil War. We're probably going to be talking about that this weekend. You know, during the political wisdom that the workers are demonstrating, intervening, you know, the British workers against their country, intervening on the side of the South. In other words, there's like an organized socialist movement, and Das Kapital could find an object of critique. So it's kind of that, you know, click right there where I realized kind of all of the debates on, you know, Marx's Capital that I mentioned at the beginning, just that whole, you know, all this stuff that everyone rolled their eyes. that this is what becomes of the text when there's not an organized proletarian socialist movement, meaning it kind of just becomes a theory that's either right or wrong, and people are trying to solve these things like that. And it made me realize, actually, at the time, that even when Marx seems to solve conundrums, so you'll see Marx say, well, I solved something that political economy hasn't been able to do ever, or something like that. That even when he solves it, the solution is not like a better theory, but it's supposed to be scandalous. So writing to Ferdinand Lassalle on February 22nd, 1858, Marx said that his critique was a critique of economic categories, or if you like, a critical expose of the system of bourgeois economy. It is at once an expose, and by the same token, a critique of the system, meaning in explaining it, it's actually the critique at the same time, right? That is, when Marx gives solutions such as the derivation of money, this is in chapter 1 of Capital, the reproduction of the social product, this is the last part of volume 2, or the transformation of values into prices, I'll talk a little bit about that later, they're supposed to be scandalous, demonstrating that bourgeois society has betrayed itself, that the kind of desiderata that was expressed in the categories has only been realized in the complete opposite. The law of realization, said Lenin, like every other law of capitalism, is implemented only by not being implemented. So Marx's solution then was about how the law of value is regularly violated, or rather, and this is kind of key, we'll talk a bit about this, held together by being violated, meaning it can only be achieved as a way in which it's actually betraying the whole intention of it. And that's why it's a critique of the socialist movement. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. The general will of society, which is supposed to be found in labor, and I know you guys are reading Rousseau this week, can only be expressed as the general dependence of society on capital, precisely violating the bourgeois conception of the general will. This is why it is difficult to treat Das Kapital as some finished accomplishment. As Jeff Pilling put it, this is a sort of Trotskyist from the mid-20th century, Marx did not set out to merely explain the necessity of social relations of capital. This would be an entirely one-sided view of Marx's work, a view which can, under certain circumstances, transform Marxism into its opposite, into an instrument for justifying these very social relations. So I have an example at the end if people want to talk about it. The social relations of capitalism exist in a state of relative, not absolute equilibrium, an equilibrium which must be overcome through the struggle of opposed forces which arise on the basis of these social relations. In this way, Marx grasped always that investigator, if his work was to be truly scientific, must place at the very center of his endeavors a conscious struggle to understand his own relationship to the forces being analyzed. This in turn was, for Marx, inseparable from a study of his own struggle in theory and praxis to grasp these facts. Thus, in the Communist Manifesto we read, finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the process of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact, within the whole range of the old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Okay, so here Marx and Engels were in fact writing about themselves. So what ends up happening today, when we kind of don't have that possibility to kind of join this, movement and give an immanent and internal critique, a dialectical critique, a self-reflexive critique, I find that it turns Marx's critique of political economy into, like, this was a popular term in my youth, a heterodox economic theory. So the Journal of Heterodox Economics, and it's like Marxist and Sraffian, this kind of thing. Because one has to treat the categories as fixed, even if one is describing the contradictions and crises of capitalist society and how potential is wasted, how things need to change. So all of left Ricardianism and Proudhon had already said, this is all obsolete, this is all wrong, this is contradictory, and this needs to change, right? And today that's ascribed to Marx. So we have a great panel from 2013 in Platypus, a vert critique panel, and I asked a question from the crowd on the panel, which basically was like, what are you saying that's new here, right? In other words, they were ascribing to Marx like, well, it's value critique, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, all of these people prior to him already said it. I'll have some examples later. And so the question was, what was new, right? What is Marx's intervention? The problem is how one is led to try to prove the account or the approach without having any real object of critique. without the opportunity to give a critique of the proletarian socialist movement, one is backed into a corner. They either have to treat the system as fixed and therefore lose the historical character of the categories in order to accurately portray the movement of society, and this ends up regressing back into bourgeois political economy. So a lot of Marxist economics, quote unquote, is left Ricardianism. It's just an old thing that's kind of become obscure to itself. Or they fall into some kind of postmodern view. This may be more of a minority view where it's like, well, you know, it's just ideology. It's like Althusser, and it's just kind of bullshit or something, or like, I don't know, neoliberalism made up economics. Economics is a white thing, this kind of thing like that. You know, and then it's just like, well, what are we even saying? So the orthodox Marxists could hold that they describe reality better than the sycophants of, you know, vulgar political economy, as Spencer likes to say, of the bourgeoisie, because the latter refused to recognize the ideological character of bourgeois political economy, and thus the discrepancy. But Marxists could also use this discrepancy to raise the necessity of seizing the commanding heights of society and transforming the world. Otherwise, the proletariat will continue to be chained to their oppression. Meaning, you know, you're mentioning Lenin and Luxemburg earlier. They could simultaneously say that they could explain things better, but they could explain things better because they recognize the ideological character of bourgeois political economy. Because showing that discrepancy, like how these categories are becoming obsolete, anachronistic, ideological, was tasking to the proletariat of the need to, it was pushing them like politically. There's kind of a famous line by Marx early, I think it's 1844, the Critical Notes, where he talks about the Silesian weavers becoming theoretical. And he's saying they're becoming theoretical because in practice things are not making sense. So it's pushing them to like study political economy, to study the world, to study politics, the mysteries of international diplomacy, as Marx puts it later. Whereas today, it's kind of like, we don't have that object, so people are either like trying to prove Adam Smith to then say Adam Smith is wrong, kind of implicitly, or it just becomes some other kind of thing like that. So in order to understand what Marx and Engels find in the critique of political economy, it's important to retrace the steps to Das Kapital. So let me try to speed this up a little bit. It's important to note that the background to Marx and Engels' interest in political economy is that political economy is already in crisis, and in a sense, already out the door. So David Ricardo kind of famously says like two things, and after him, just political economy disintegrates. It's kind of mirroring what's happening with Hegel's death, that there's a disintegration of Hegelianism, there's a disintegration of Ricardianism. So David Ricardo is trying to make sense of Adam Smith, and he says, well, the principle of political economy is labor, right? You know, all these people have written since Adam Smith's time, and some of it's cool and some of it's bad. They've all forgotten it's labor, labor, labor. Then David Ricardo ends his text by saying, and those wealthiest countries are those that have the most limited labor. And this instantly like sets off kind of alarms to people. So Sismondi kind of jokingly says to David Ricardo, well, like in a polemic, he's like, well, that would mean that the wealthiest nation is one that it's just a king on an island, like cranking a robot, because then there's like no labor there, and then they're just getting the whole surplus. In other words, what he's saying is, David Ricardo is saying the point is to like get rid of everybody. And obviously this is kind of, you know, people can't make sense of it, or they're trying to hold it together. So much of what is frequently ascribed to Marx was already said by political economists. I mentioned this earlier. So Adam Smith's doubts seem to have been presciently damned when John Barton and David Ricardo talk about the redundancy of labor. They're talking about machinery. Oh, machinery's giving a reserve army. Ricardo, for Marx, had already demonstrated all sorts of strange things are regulated by labor, right? All of these arguments that are usually ascribed to Marx. Thomas Hodgkin had already said, look, labor, it doesn't make the same sense that it did maybe in the Middle Ages. There's a guy named Chaberlet who Marx quotes now and then. He's kind of a contemporary of Marx. And Chaberlet has this quote about, I'm not going to read all of it, but he basically says, capital's making a numerous class of proletarians in a position of subjugation and political impotence. And basically one day they're going to rise up and seize capital. Right, so this is Chaberlet, this is before the Communist Manifesto. He's a contemporary socialist. So there's already this idea of the Industrial Revolution's creating these people, and something's got to give, right? They're gonna take a revolution. And And of course, one of the ways in which Marx and Engels reconcile, because I guess they have not a nice first meeting, that's kind of dramatized in the movie, is through Engels sends in an outline of a critique of political economy, right? And I think it's December of 1843. And Engels already demonstrates that, look, if you follow political economy consistently, it already damns all of the world as it is, right? It explains that, everything's become the opposite. He's already given I always mispronounce the word, a manic critique of political economy. And he's also already saying, for the English socialists have long proved both practically and theoretically that the latter are in the position to settle economic questions more correctly, even from an economic point of view. Meaning he's already saying, he's linking the whole thing, the crisis of political economy, to the necessity of socialism. But something that Engels is clear about that maybe is a little bit different than the socialists, I mean, maybe some of them are kind of say something like this. There's this great quote where he goes, "The nearer to our time the economists whom we have to judge, the more severe must our judgment become. For while Smith and Malthus found only scattered fragments, the modern economists had the whole system complete before them. The consequences had all been drawn. The contradictions came clearly enough to light, yet they did not come to examining the premises and still accepted the responsibility for the whole system. The nearer the economists come to the present time, the further they depart from honesty. With every advance of time, sophistry necessarily increases so as to prevent economics from lagging behind the times. This is why Ricardo, for instance, is more guilty than Adam Smith, and McCulloch and Mill more guilty than Ricardo." So he's saying there's something different from Adam Smith's time to our time. And in the volume 1, kind of the chapters 13 through 15, cooperation, manufacture, and then large-scale industry, this is Marx tracing the difference, what had developed since then. And it's why the history of political economy becomes important for Marx, because, to quote Engels, it's the adequate consciousness of the time. So Marx and Engels are saying, it's not that Adam Smith was dumb, it's that actually the contradiction in the sense had not been revealed. Right? There wasn't a way in which he could kind of say these things. And it's why Adam Smith ends up looking prescient. And this comes to my next point, which is Marx reads this. You can read his notes on Engels' thing. They become friends, right? It's fantastic in 1844. And if you read his manuscripts, most people kind of read the more essayistic parts, but he starts off the whole manuscripts with just long quotes from Smith, just quotes from Smith, Ricardo. And I think sometimes this is kind of skipped over because people are like, I'll just go and read Adam Smith. I don't need to read somebody else quoting him. But Marx kind of is vocalizing Smith to make him sound like a socialist. So he says something like, he'll quote Smith and then say something like, the surplus would have to die, or hence overproduction. Or, since, however, according to Smith, a society is not happy of which the greater part suffers, yet even the wealthiest state of society leads to the suffering of the majority, and since the economic system leads, leads to the wealthiest condition, it follows that the goal of the economic system is the unhappiness of society. He puts these selections of Adam Smith side by side with communists like Wilhelm Schultz. So the phrase contradiction of forces in relations to production is this sort of unknown German economist, that's where it comes from, and Constantin Pécor, who's a French kind of communist, sort of utopian communist. This is important. Smith appears to simultaneously be demanding the social relations of society and condemning them. Marx would later say that Smith's successors take opposing stands based on one aspect of his teaching or the other. What Marx is getting at here is that Smith has become contradictory, and that consequently the recrudescence of bourgeois political economy is expressing the crisis of society through socialism. Meaning Adam Smith is kind of, Marx puts it, the revolutionary bourgeoisie. So if you're in the reading group, you'll be reading Smith in the coming 2 weeks, right? And Smith is basically making like an ought argument, right? The world ought to be regulated by labor. Whereas David Ricardo is actually trying to prove more that it is, right? He's no longer making kind of a normative argument, but trying to say people have kind of lost their way. And yet, Marx reading Adam Smith is like, well, this looks like it's, condemning the world around me. Now, that's not something that Marx is inventing. That's what the entire socialist movement did. And so this is why the politicization of political economy is expressing the crisis in society. Meaning the ruling class is saying Adam Smith, the proletariat is saying Adam Smith. And Marx is saying they're both right, they're both wrong. It's antinomical. Smith has become contradictory as a consequence of what has developed since his time. And that's a way of explaining the consciousness of the proletariat, meaning, just to give a little digression very quickly, you can think of like in the bourgeois revolutions, it looks to us today as if they were vying for the value of their labor, right? So you have a serf, you have a slave, and they're like, I don't get to have control over the value of labor. I don't get the full proceeds of my labor. This is a socialist slogan from the 19th century. And so consequently, the bourgeois revolution was about emancipation of labor. Now that kind of slogan and that kind of view repeats after the Industrial Revolution, but it's repeating in changed conditions. So what Marx is seeing when he's seeing the proletarian socialist movement like reach for Adam Smith is a repetition, right? And that repetition is a repetition under changed conditions. And that's why it's symptomatic. I think we were talking last night about the letter to Ruga, right, on communism. Communism as a dogmatic abstraction, right? So at the end of that, Marx says, well, when we get to the bottom of it, we're going to see it's not a new task, but the work of the old world, right? Meaning when you get to the very bottom of socialism, you're going to find out that it's the repetition of the bourgeois revolution. And it's being expressed in the repetition of bourgeois political economy. So, to give an example, and this is why Marx seems to pick on Proudhon, this is from the Holy Family. All treatises on political economy take private property for granted. All economics does, by the way. This basic premise is for them an incontestable fact to which they devote no further investigation. Indeed, a fact which is spoken about only as accident, as Say naively admits. But Proudhon makes a critical investigation, so I'll be very clear about this right here. The first resolute, ruthless, and at the same time scientific investigation of the basis of political economy, private property. He's talking about labor here. It's not, the colloquial rich people kind of thing. This is the great scientific advance he made, an advance which revolutionizes political economy. And here's the key point. And for the first time makes a real science of political economy possible. So Marx is saying, because Proudhon has given a critique of political economy, now I can give a critique of political economy. Right, it's not like he's done it, I'm going to do it better or something. He's like, no, Proudhon has given the standpoint of the proletariat, which is kind of famously, I remember seeing this at Occupy, property is theft, right? We all know this, right? Okay, that's like a Proudhon slogan, and it's a contradiction, right? Because you have to presuppose property for it to be theft at all, right? And so it's one of these things why it's like, okay, why don't you just say that's just dumb? You forget this logical. It's a logical fallacy. I got you, Proudhon, right? Because for Marx, that's the necessary form of appearance of the proletarian standpoint, that it actually truly looks like, one's own labor, which was supposed to be the basis for property, comes from without, is alien, right? Estranged labor, as Marx puts it. And so Marx continues, Proudhon's treatise, What is Property, is as important for modern political economy as Sieyès' work, What is the Third Estate for Modern Politics? So he's relating it to the bourgeois revolution. Proudhon takes the human semblance of the economic relations seriously and sharply opposes it to their inhuman reality. So labor opposed to private property in the colloquial sense. He forces them to be in reality what they imagine themselves to be, or rather to give up their own ideas of themselves and confess their real inhumanity. He therefore consistently depicts as the falsifier of economic relations, not this or that kind of private property, but private property as such and in its entirety. He has done all the criticism of political economy from the standpoint of political economy can do. So in a sense, Proudhon's already exhausting the critique of political economy, right? You can also read a later thing that Marx kind of famously flips, so the philosophy of poverty, and Marx turns it into the poverty of philosophy. Proudhon already does, I'm going to take the categories of political economy, I'm going to dialectically critique them, and I'm going to show this kind of, unity and everything like that. I'm going to bring political economy together with Hegelianism. So that which is usually ascribed to Marx already been done by Proudhon and is already exhausted in Marx's view. So this is a running theme of Marx and Engels during this period of self-clarification. I heard someone last night talk about the gnawing criticism of mice. Somebody mentioned it, right? They were writing the German ideology, and then Marx and Engels abandoned it to the knowing criticism of nice. So this is during that period. They came to realize that there's a certain exhaustion to the critique, at least in the classical revolutionary bourgeois sense. Thus, Marx and Engels, thus the young Hegelians would make remarks like the following. So this is Herr Edgar, is one of the young Hegelians. I think it's Edgar Bauer. The modern worker thinks only of himself. He allows himself to be paid only for his own person. It is he himself who fails to take into account the enormous, the immeasurable power which arises from his cooperation with other powers. So this is a kind of naive dialectical view, meaning the young Hegelians are saying, well, the problem with the workers is they're not dialectical enough. They're like too partial and one-sided, and they need to recognize the social cooperation of their powers. But Marx responds that the workers are, quote, painfully aware of the difference between being and thinking. The appearance of one-sided thinking rather expresses the one-sided character of their situation, and that's what could potentially propel workers with the active intervention of communists, right? Meaning, I mentioned it earlier, the Silesian Weavers' Rebellion, that the workers are being led to become more theoretical because of the painful awareness of the difference between how things appear to them and what they seem to actually be, right? The kind of irrational character. And that's kind of the value of the proletariat there. And this is already also showing and this is important for the entire critique of political economy for Marx and Engels, they're always going to take the standpoint of the class. So a contemporary of theirs, Lassalle, who's also like into Hegel, and he's like popular and everything, is working class person. Working class, like the intellectual, he's always describing things from a kind of individual standpoint, from just like a bourgeois standpoint, or just like a democratic standpoint. And Marx and Engels always want to look at the laws of political economy through a class standpoint. And that's how they're already posing the question to them of what's to be done. So I'm going to just read a Lenin quote from 1908, which I think will pose the problem of rationality and the task of socialism very well. So here's, as Lenin would put it, every individual producer in the world economic system realizes that he is introducing a certain change into the technique of production. Every owner realizes that he exchanges certain products for others, but these producers and these owners do not realize that in doing so, they're thereby changing social being. So it's the famous social being determines consciousness. The sum total, this is my favorite line, the sum total of these changes and all the ramifications in the capitalist world economy could not be grasped by even 70 Marxes. The paramount thing is that these laws of these changes have been discovered, that the objective logic of these changes and their historical development have at bottom and in the main been disclosed. Objective, not in the sense that a society of conscious beings, men, could exist and develop independently of the existence of conscious beings, but in the sense that social being is independent of the social consciousness of men. You may want to come back to that later. That's usually a kind of contentious line. The fact that you live and conduct your business, beget children, produce products and exchange them, gives rise to an objectively necessary chain of events, a chain of development, which is independent of your social consciousness and is never grasped by the latter completely. The highest task of humanity is to comprehend the subjective logic of economic evolution in its general and fundamental features, so that it may be possible to adapt to it one's social consciousness and the consciousness of the advanced classes of all capitalist countries in a definite, clear, and critical as fashion as possible. So in a sense, Lenin right here is actually summarizing kind of the point that Marx and Engels had come to prior to 1848, which is what I'm going to discuss about next, which is, okay, there's a problem in society, and it's going to need basically the democratic rule that's led by the proletariat. It's kind of a proletarian hegemony. They haven't come to a dictatorship of the proletariat yet. In order for the workers to put through the reforms, I think Marx and Engels are describing the proletariat as the extreme democratic party at this time. This is important, that's why I mentioned it, because of the experience of 1848. And the kind of idea is that what socialism's really going to do is that last sentence that I mentioned by Lenin, which is actually going to set up the basis for emancipation. It's not that socialism is kind of the end right there. So onto the experience of 1848. Also, feel free to, yes, go ahead.
This is just a clarification.
Yeah.
So the reason why theory needs the proletarian politics is because in order to have a contradiction in capital, you have to have, you're saying on one side the bourgeoisie is saying Adam Smith, the other side the working class is saying Adam Smith. But if the working class isn't saying Adam Smith, you don't have a contradiction in Marx. But you have a contradiction in capital to come up.
What was the first part of the question?
It was all one question.
Oh, okay.
Why is it that you can't have theory without the proletarian struggle for socialism? Why is that political context necessary?
Right, right. So I guess part of it in terms of the critique of the proletarian socialist movement is that to the degree that they become conscious of the problem, then actually it's clarifying to society as a whole. Meaning the point I was making earlier about like someone like Proudhon as being a standpoint of the proletariat, is Marx is saying that's actually giving me an object of critique in the first place.
Yudkowsky has a nice way of putting it in his book about capital and the critique of political economy, which is that the proletariat learns from the machines and it learns from the development of capital, and then it also organizes the development of capitalism. And so the existence of the proletarian struggle for socialism, their demands on capitalism actually organize the problem in a conscious way, right? Mediated by politics and ideas. And that makes it possible to have a critical intervention, right, at the level of theory. Why? Because the practical reproduction of capitalism, the revolution of capital, like we shouldn't forget, capital is revolutionary for Marx, that the revolution of capital is being given some sort of conscious form. And that's necessary for the criticism of political economy. And what's specific to Marx, as in, so without that, it's not like you can't have criticisms of economics or the status quo. There are plenty of them, right? There are plenty of people who criticize it, the way that our economy works. I mean, Danny was naming some of these people. But the kind of particular function of Marxism to show, and this is why I quoted the Adorno, the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat and of proletarian leadership of the bourgeois revolution, that we can't take for granted. We don't know that it's true. The truth isn't in the pudding. There's no kind of evidence in reality that that would be the case.
It has to do with the ends of the critique, basically. Meaning, for one of the ways in which Marx and Engels are intervening in the 1840s is that some of the socialists are, say, apolitical, right? So they think it's like a problem that can be solved in civil society's organization. Robert Owen, for example, I'm going to go and found New Lanark. And they're saying, no, this is a problem with the social relations of reality. This is actually a political question, right? Like, in other words, morally, they're saying you actually can't kind of judge. If there's a contradiction in property rights, then you can validly get two people stealing from each other. Right? This is kind of what Marx parrots in chapter 10 of Capital, when he says, well, the worker claims the capitalist steals from him, and the capitalist claims the worker steals from them. Right? When right meets right, might decides. It's actually posing a political question right there, and it's actually going into kind of 1848. So one of the reasons why Marx and Engels in the manifesto would say, like, the revolution's inevitable is because they're like, people are going to try to do something about this because it looks wrong, based on the world that they were born into. They're like, oh, okay, this is the Constitution, and the ruling class is usurping property, and they're violating the Constitution. That's what all of the left Ricardians are saying. Right? They're saying all the ruling class, they're not actually following the laws of private property. They're usurping private property. They've made up this fiction. It's a conspiracy, this kind of thing like that. So before Marx even began writing the Grundrisse, his notebooks, he had already concluded what he thought was his new contribution, the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is important to keep in mind in judging all subsequent developments. When you go and read Capital on your own, like, this is about the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Keep that every sentence. While the ancient proletariat lived at the expense of society, modern society lived at the expense of the modern proletariat. The statement by Jean-Charles Leonard de Sismondi characterized the modern proletariat as citizens without property. Right, so you're getting the contradiction of civil society with the political sphere. So citizens, they have the right. So citizens without property is kind of how it appears. They actually do have property. They have their labor. but it appears like they don't have property. Hence, prudent, right? Property is theft.
Probably an incidental.
Yeah, go ahead.
What does it mean to say that the proletariat used to live at the expense of society?
Yes, I like, bread and roses kind of stuff, meaning like the proletariat were like literally just as superfluous. This is kind of what Sismondi is saying, and kind of had to be put together. They maybe couldn't have the, and I want to say the custom or privilege to work certain things. Right, this is sometimes how Engels describes the declension of Rome as like, well, free workers couldn't do the jobs that slaves did, which would have been, I don't know, agricultural labor. And so all sorts of habits and customs and stuff, there were just people who weren't allowed to do things, didn't have property because they didn't count as citizens, and you had to do something with them. Marx has all of these, like, this history of laws and capital, kind of the last section, where he's describing what they used to do with people who didn't have property. They just hang them. Right, or chop their ear off or something like that. And then he's showing how the laws have changed because modern society can't do that with the unemployed anymore. They just cut their heads off, right? That's correct. That's a correct statement, yeah. So the point being that modern society has internalized the crisis of civil society, right? We just talk about unemployment benefits, right? I think they're running out soon or something like that. It's just a normal legislative, Congress has to extend things. No, that's the crisis of bourgeois society is unemployment. So despite the value of one's labor becoming nil when they were unemployed, they do have rights as citizens. They are exploited, whereas the ancient proletariat, by today's standards, shared in the exploitation of those who worked. I mean, they were being like, here, we got to do something with them with the surplus of other people. The social quality of labor and the capitalist quality of this social labor became ever more impossible to meet, hence the phenomenon of unemployment. Importantly, this is not an economic process, but the estrangement of a right. It looks like a democratic revolution is necessary to restore the usurpation of a person's inalienable rights. So this is what I was saying earlier, these phrases about the inevitability of revolution, right? In other words, what's happening in 1848, as Marx and Engels very famously described, it looks like a bourgeois revolution. The rights of people, the right to life, the right to labor has been taken away from you. We have to overthrow them. In France, it's like a financial aristocracy. They have all these caricatures of him turning into a pear, blah, blah, blah. We have to overthrow him. Okay. This also meant that democracy became contradictory under industrial production. Democracy as one person, one vote bore the same equality of property owners in exchange. This raised the task. So I'm going to quote Engels right here. A drowning man clutches at any straw, nor can he wait for a boat to push off from the bank and come to his rescue. The boat is socialist revolution. The straw, protective tariffs and state socialism. So he's talking about Bismarck right there. The overproduction of value, this is unemployment, is further intensified by those workers thrown to the curb who use their political rights to ameliorate the consequences of a contradictory civil society. So democracy is a crisis of bourgeois society, as a symptom of capitalism. The National Assembly, representing the autonomy of the nation versus its heteronomy, voted to abolish universal suffrage in May of 1850. This was a coup d'etat of the bourgeoisie. In restoring suffrage for the democratic masses of France, Louis Bonaparte had preserved the value of their labor. I mean, the way in which workers are trying to realize the value of their labor, right, which sometimes maybe more colloquially would be described as like the dignity of human life, right? In other words, this is the representation of human society, is being achieved through an overthrow of the bourgeoisie, through the overthrow of the capitalists, through the expropriation of the capitalists, and as Marx, demonstrates in the 1848 revolutions, the preservation of capitalism, right? And this is where he's drawing from this, the need for a dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning he basically sees a kind of socialist revolution play out in 1848. Value for Marx was constituted, quote, not by the time needed to produce it by itself, but in relation to the quota of each and every other product which can be created in the same time. This meant that value was a producer's social standing with respect to the rest of society. It is only the fetish of commodities that makes it appear to be a quality of things rather than our relation, or maybe I should say lack of relation, to society. By comparing our labor with others, we determine how we sit in social production. It is only in exchange that the social character of the capitalist production process becomes explicit and intelligible, although this shows it was implicit even in isolated production. It is a very superficial reading of the 18th Brumaire to think it is about the peasants and the urban gangs from a demographic standpoint, right? Because, oh, it's the lumpen proletariat, so people, really turned it into sociology. The quote, they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. The Industrial Reserve Army included the lumpen proletariat and the peasants, but it also included the workers. They are the potential to reconstitute bourgeois society or to support a socialist revolution, hence the task of the dictatorship of the proletariat being posed in practice. The same things that could lead to socialism can also lead to its preservation, right? Hence we're getting at, again, you brought up the question earlier about theory. This is an example right here, right? Either it's going to be the infinite oppression until the sun explodes, or potentially socialism. As Lenin would say in response to Karl Kautsky many years later when they were fighting, right, so when they were polemicizing. And this is even more special because Karl Kautsky has a hand in editing the later volumes of Capital. So this is Lenin reminding him about something regarding Das Kapital. The issue is this: which of the main forces, the proletariat or the bourgeoisie, will these intermediate sections join? There cannot be any third way. He who has not understood this from reading Marx's Capital has understood nothing in Marx, understood nothing in socialism, but is in fact a Philistine and a petty bourgeoisie who blindly follows in the wake of the bourgeoisie. On the other hand, he who has understood all this will not allow himself to be deceived by empty phrases about freedom and equality, but will think and speak of practical things, that is, of the concrete conditions for rapprochement between the peasants and the workers, their alliances against the capitalists, agreement between them against the exploiters, the rich and the profiteers. Right? In other words, Lenin just summarized all of Das Kapital for everybody in the room, which is it's about democracy, it's about the dictatorship of the proletariat. And he's saying anyone who hasn't got that from Capital is a Philistine. So there you go, right there. In the aftermath of the liberals collapsing in the National Assembly, Engels writes to Marx that they can finally split with this, quote, herd of jackasses in the Communist League. What price all the tittle-tattle the entire emigre crowd can muster against you when you answer it with your political economy? A few months later, Marx writes to Engels, identifying the fulcrum of his critique. Enfin, this science has made no progress since Adam Smith or David Ricardo, however much has been done in the way of individual research, often extremely discerning. Smith, of course, being the kind of economist par excellence of manufacturing, which is maybe something that's kind of hard for us to imagine today, and Ricardo as the economist par excellence of the Industrial Revolution. So Marx is just saying, a lot of people have written fun stuff, there's been no progress. Because in a sense, he's saying it kind of ended with Ricardo. We might even say it ended with Smith, and really it's the crisis is registered with Ricardo. Classical political economy, the consciousness of the bourgeois revolution, had been preserved by the proletarian socialist movement, who politicized political economy against the rapacious landlord, the usurious capitalists, and the economic fiction by which capital becomes an agent of production. So those were all left Ricardians, their invectives. That is, they were seeking to realize the socialist relations that were articulated in classical political economy while integrating themselves into an industrial process where the social relations burst asunder. Regular reference is made, I'm almost at a pause so we can talk again. Regular reference is made to the statement that the categories of political economy, this is in the introduction to his contribution to critique, quote, express the forms of being, the characteristics of existence, and often only individual sides of the specific society, this subject, which is bourgeois society. David McGregor adds, after quoting what I just quoted, that if the categories express the relations of society, this is only because they also create them, through the mediation of concrete human practice. But this touches on only one side of the problem, meaning just to kind of put in other words what David was just saying, things like money, labor, property, Marx and Engels are saying that these are modes of existence, literally how social practice and kind of reflections on these. And David is saying, and this is because we literally produce those categories. So very clear right there, we're producing the political economic categories in that sense, but the conditions that give rise to that necessary reflection. And so this is why the critique of political economy is not just the critique of mere thinking, but actually an insight into social practice itself. But I wanted to add something to this. This touches on only one side of the problem. It is only partially correct to say that the categories produce the relations, because the relations that they produce is the contradiction between bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production. The categories of political economy have become ideological. This is important to keep in mind when considering Marx's object of critique. It is the proletariat which is both trying to preserve and overthrow bourgeois social relations. And the classic example in 1848 is the right to work, right? Which Marx calls an awkward demand, right? It's kind of like, he's literally saying, well, actually capital can't do so. And so what he's saying right there is their bourgeois demand, it's like a right to work and they're going to vote for it and they're doing this through their rights as citizens. He's like, if they're going to do that, that's actually pushing beyond bourgeois society. So the reason I bring this up is the way in which the workers are politicizing political economy is actually pointing beyond political economy, while also being the ideological forms that, can potentially be obstacles for the workers preserving capitalism. So this goes back to, again, the practical character of the theoretical critique of political economy, the Adorno quote that Aaron read at the beginning, why it's like, yeah, the theory of surplus value doesn't say, and then do X, Y, and Z. But it could work in Marx's time because what the critique was doing was kind of opening up the necessity of social transformation, of the workers leading things, and of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So, I just have little points to remember, like 2 points. And I'll just talk about, or any questions so far?
I
No?
think we should try and wrap up.
Okay, we'll try to. Okay, so, all right, Das Kapital is about the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Without an organized movement, it's kind of hard to say that, so it becomes some kind of alternative economic theory. And just to give an example of why that's the case, the last sentence of chapter 32, it's like kind of a famous line, is the expropriation of the expropriators. So it's like a callback to the Communist Manifesto. And as I was mentioning earlier, Louis Bonaparte in 1848, we can say Bismarck as well, we can talk about the Polish Revolution as well, expropriates the capitalists, right? The expropriators are expropriated, and he puts through a kind of socialism in 1848. And so the reason I bring that up is from a liberal standpoint, as Rousseau points out in this week's readings, the final kind of guarantor of property is society. It's what he calls the state, so the kind of political expression, not what Marx calls the state. And so from a liberal standpoint, they can justify expropriating anybody, right? Like in other words, they can say there's no property without us, and it's that basic contract that's necessary to preserve property in the first place, right? Like this is the kind of basis. And in doing so, you can just preserve capitalism, right? I think Trotsky says the same thing about Hitler. He's like, yeah, he expropriates all the capitalists to save capitalism, right? And like, Hitler kills all of them. That's how you save capitalism. So, the Marx point then here is that either, the expropriation is going to happen and it's just going to be the preservation of capitalism, or the workers are going to recognize how that's going to preserve the repression and instead the need for the dictatorship of the proletariat. And so that's kind of where capital is coming to a certain penultimate point. And then one other thing, in terms of Das Kapital is about being democracy, I want to have a little esoteric quote to show that even things that are seemingly very technical actually have a sort of political side to them. So I'm going to take a random quote from volume 3. It's not random because I chose it. I know, exactly. It looks like it's very technical. So in the section on the transformation of values to prices, which was a whole, there's all this, there's a contention about it and all sorts of things like that. And, Engels had this whole competition of people trying to solve it. Marx says, such a general rate of surplus value, viewed as a tendency like all other economic laws, everything else that Marx is discussing, has been assumed by us for the sake of theoretical simplification. But in reality, it is an actual premise in the capitalist mode of production, although it is more or less obstructed by practical frictions causing more or less considerable local differences, such as the settlement laws for farm laborers in Britain. But in theory, it is assumed that the laws of capitalist production operate in their pure form. In reality, there exists only approximation, but this approximation is the greater the more developed the capitalist mode of production, and the less it is adulterated and amalgamated with survivals of former economic conditions. So these former economic conditions right there, here's another way in which we can describe it: petty bourgeois democracy. And so what Marx is saying right here is that the clarity of the laws of, capitalist production only come out to the degree that the class struggle is developed. So even something, in this case, he's literally describing how there's an equalization of profit, these seemingly very technical economic questions. And he's saying it only actually clarifies itself under a political struggle. That's what class struggle is. And to the degree that they're adulterated or inhibited by, as he puts it, survivals of former economic conditions, it's to the degree that classes become, kind of blocked by just general democracy, right? Which is what's happening in 1848. I think Marx says once the proletariat are smashed in June, class struggle exits stage, and then it's just rackets and democracy. And so again, everything that Marx is saying to the workers, he's saying the clarity comes out to the degree that you organize yourself as a class, independently against the capitalist class. And that without that, there is no class clarification and everything's just a homogeneous blob of democracy. So I have other things as well, but we can stop there. And, a bunch of questions and stuff. And I think...
Yeah. Can we get up here for Justin?
Yeah.
I also have one from online.
Oh, nice. Okay, cool.
No, it's not here.
Okay.
He's also right into it.
Right into it? Okay,
Oh,
cool.
Once you read it.
Yeah, no. What is he too soft or too loud?
Hold it right up to your mouth.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask a question because all that makes sense. Like the problem is that if capitalism outlets the class struggle, then we no longer have a way of articulating the crisis of bourgeois society. I guess it comes back to my understanding of crisis as sort of embodying an ambivalent potential as that depends on consciousness. So for Marx, the Critique of Political Economy had, as he said, already entered into crisis, and then the recognition of that in theory involved, I guess, an assertion that theory and practice were identical in some sense. He's asserting, I guess it kind of goes back to Hegel, I guess, where things were put in a relation of identity to each other because they appeared distinct, and there had to be that relation of difference in order for the relation of identity to take place. I guess my point in saying all this, it's a little disorganized, sorry, is a big sticking point for the Platypus pedagogy is the distinction between bourgeois society and capitalism, which I also think has a lot to do with asserting that theory and practice are distinct as well. And I guess if previously the proletariat was, as you said, Aaron, organizing the problem of capitalism, that this made possible a critical intervention at the level of theory. I guess I just wanted to sort of place in my mind how this works with regard to Platypus. Is Platypus making a critical intervention at the level of practice, trying to assert, because theory and practice appear the same today, that they're actually non-identical?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. I mean, part of it is through the history of the left. For example, the death of the left. This is not maybe a historical standpoint that is going to be taken by most of the left today, right? There's going to be a sense of progress. I mean, part of what I was trying to do here is that people kind of feel like they can at least stand, the phrase stand on the shoulders of Marx's Critique of Political Economy, so that even if, people around the world are not organizing, we know how the world operates. I think just to give an example, I heard in an interview with Chris recently, someone said something like, well, people can become worse at chess, but the rules of chess are still the same, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Meaning they were kind of registering regression only subjectively, just that people have become worse leftists and maybe become worse readers. And I'm trying to say actually that, to the degree, it goes back to the beginning of how I kind of came to understanding this text in Platypus, to the degree that actually capital has become opaque and occluded or starts to look like another economic theory, that to me is a reflection of practice. That's why I was trying to draw out the question of class earlier. Now that's a point that I'm arguing for, right? Certainly we can go and find, I've interviewed people who have said, no, this is a great theory and I'm going to, predict the next recession, the next 10 of 6 recessions, kind of things like that, right? Because the rate of profit, and you can like look on, you know, business indicators or something like that. And it's, you know, I'm making a kind of counter argument to some degree by saying like, look, that's what's become of the text to you because the object of critique isn't there anymore. And, you know, this is an argument at the level of what I think is possible as opposed to saying, no, yeah, we can just kind of pick up the text. I don't know if that directly answered the question, but that's how I don't know, the reading of these texts, as Aaron talks about, there's 1 billion Das Kapital reading groups.
Yeah.
And yeah, go
It
ahead.
makes sense because, I mean, I guess the problem with Marxism was that the actual theory was obscuring the fact that practice pointed beyond itself, or that Marxist theory became an obstacle to the struggle for socialism and the crisis of Marxism. And now we're sort of stuck with the inverse problem, which is that the subordination of theory to practice, or the practice obscures theory rather than the other way around, I guess.
Yeah, a little bit happened in the Second International. I'm not going to read this quote, but I can, I don't know, send it out later. So I have a very long quote from Bernstein, who we know as the executor of Engels' will and was, you know, close, and Marx praises him at one time, like, you know, before he dies. He's the kind of archetypical revisionist Marxist, that he thinks that Marx and Engels actually prove the obsolescence of their own theory. It's a kind of very long quote. And the reason I bring that up is because in that sense, already in the Second International, Marxist critique is becoming obscure. And you're getting all these different sides. You're getting like the orthodoxy, who are saying kind of something more similar to what we hear today, of like, it's the correct theory, it's the correct, we're going to prove it empirically. And then other people are saying, no, it actually is no longer true. It was maybe somewhat true in Marx's time, or more true in the early 19th century. And that's a repetition of actually earlier moments in political economy that I mentioned. So like, you know, in terms of the inverse problem today, I guess it's just me asking the question of what could Marx assume in his time, right? The proletarian socialist movement. And that's why I gave this anecdote about me and like labor at the beginning. I'm like, why is he talking about labor? Why is it all labor? It's because the workers are talking about labor and politicizing that. And without that, it's just a strange thing that he seems to assume. It looks like you have another question.
Oh, no, I'm just, well, what that makes me think about is, you know, this is called like reading Marxist Capital. I guess maybe part of it is part of the point is that maybe reading Capital has become almost like a practical compulsion, and to overcome that compulsion, so that maybe we can, I mean, I guess, yeah.
I mean, you know, something that Danny said, and I think this is really important, is that people today read Capital to make the points of like a Sismondi or a Proudhon or Adam Smith.
Yeah.
And so Marxism today is, you know, students are taught Marxism, they're taught Capital, and they're really taught a kind of bourgeois liberal perspective. And I mean, that's fine, but you know, what's the point of that? What's the point of, and I tried to address this in my introduction, right, of these new leftists reaching back to Capital as opposed to teaching you Lenin. So, you know, I was in Moish Pistone's class on Capital. He told me to never read Lenin, ever, okay? Told me to never read Lenin. I'm serious. And, you know, like, why is that? Because he doesn't want 1917 to happen again. And so, you know, is it a practical problem? Is it a theoretical problem? I think for Platypus, yes, we think that there's, you know, kind of a practical compulsion to which theory and ideas are being submitted, and that this creates theoretical obstacles to considering what was unique about Marxism. Yeah. What's the unique critical perspective of Marxism that's not accomplished by these other, you know, ideas that float around in society. And so long as Marxism is taught to students as basically, you know, maybe a weird woke version of, you know, Adam Smith or something like that. You know, how are we going to learn from the history of Marx?
I mean, well, the microphone's passing. I'll just make a small argument, which is that after Marx dies, Eugene Böhm-Bawerk, who's someone that the GMU crowd would be very familiar with because he's one of the precursors to the Austrian School of Economics. He has this whole critique of Marx, and he's like going to prove that the workers are not exploited, that it's just an exchange through time. And a lot of Marxists answered this to say, well, no, this is wrong. Actually, they are exploited. That argument is below Marxism. That's not Marx. The question is not really about are the workers exploited or not. The point is political economy said this, And then Marx was trying to demonstrate actually the obsolescence of exploiting workers. Right? It's the famous section on machinery in the Grundrisse that, like, you know, trying to base wealth on exploiting workers is a miserable foundation. The problem isn't are they exploited or not, it's like a waste of time is kind of the point. Right? It's wasting the potential of society. But this argument is then actually, like, under the guise of being Marxism versus libertarianism or something, it's actually a completely different argument. And then it's like, where do you even begin to intervene there? And so that's why, you know, I feel like to describe Capital, I want to say everything, you know, I would say this down when I lived in Houston. Capital is the last thing you should read, right? Just go and read all of Marx's political stuff, understand what he's talking about, and then finally read Capital, because everyone would come to the reading group and they go, oh, I'm reading Capital, and I'm like, would kind of cringe because I just knew like where that was going. Yeah.
So, in your remarks, you talk about how Marx was almost prompted to write this work by events in reality at the time. It was almost like the working class movement demanded him address what they were already politicizing. I wondered if you had anything to speak about regarding the historical contingency of that. Like, the workers were reading stuff on the shop floor, they were politicizing political economy, but if they politicized something else, then Marx could have easily just written a book about that instead. That to me speaks to a different point than how people treat Capital today, like as if there's something essential that you have to read Capital and it's going to tell you almost like a timeless ahistorical truth about capitalism.
Yeah, so a few things come to mind. In the Platypus reading group, we just did the New Left a few weeks ago. And so someone like Juliet Mitchell, right? So in her text, Women's Estate, she's looking at the socialist women's movement and feminism. And she literally says the problem that's lacking is a theory. So I've always interpreted that as her saying there needs to be like a Das Kapital of the women's movement or something, because she, in other words, is not seen as the symptoms of her time as something like the politicization of Adam Smith or something like that, right? This is kind of why we read the gender sexuality and the race question.
It's Rex's idea of sex economy, right? He says that Marx doesn't have to address sex economy because sex economy didn't exist in his time.
Exactly, right, exactly. And so likewise, you know, Mitchell's basically saying that as well. And so in terms of like the politicization of symptoms, it's not that Marx said, oh, you workers should go and read political economy. It's that they were politicizing it against society, right? They're like using, that's why I said he kind of uses Smith to vocalize like a average socialist, kind of saying this is why things are wrong in that sense.
I mean, it's not just like the workers happen to come across political economy. I think kind of the significance of political economy is that it's the memory of the bourgeois revolution.
Yeah. Well, but we could say this. So Marx has this early letter to Feuerbach where he's trying to get the workers to read Feuerbach, right? Like young Hegelianism, like we're going to get the workers to be this kind of bohemian Hegelian revolutionary stuff, and it's kind of not fitting with, you know, they're like that, but it's not like hitting their life like that. But it does raise that question of like maybe, you know, I think in Engels' writings on the 1848 German Revolution, he says it didn't really take like a political economics here. It took more like some kind of religious, like Unitarian kind of, you know, mode of appearance or something like that. And so I think the reason why Das Kapital has this weight is because it's seminal. Like, in other words, we have the history of like it led to the Second International and Third International and Fourth Internationals. It was the high theoretical expression of the most amazing movement to try to change the world. And yes, of course, it's linked to the bourgeois revolution. It was the consciousness of the bourgeois revolution. But the reason I bring up the Feuerbach is because so was Kant and Hegel, right? So was German idealism. So was French politics. And
the three component parts of Marxism, according to Lenin.
Yeah. So also in the manuscripts, Marx says, well, in Germany, the estrangement looks like one of reconciliation with the universal. In France, it looks like the question of equality. It's like the old French Revolution. And in England, it's production for need, not production for profit, this kind of slogan that we have today, people before profits. And so he's relating all of these different high points of the bourgeois revolution and saying, look, there's some kind of identity across them. And it happens to be the case that the most organized movement was politicized in itself. I mean, it has a pretty practical, straightforward character to it. And that's why that seemed to be the, worthy of leading to a revolution that way. But the reason I bring up Mitchell is because maybe there could have been something else like that. It's not just like contingency and something like that. It's like the New Left had this idea that they were overcoming something of the older, the old left and just classical Marxism. And it was up for them to prove that. They didn't prove that. They tell us that today, right? They go like, yeah, we made theoretical contributions, but that, raises the question of theory and praxis. But maybe in an alternate history, they could have done that, and that would have justified some other kind of symptomology. Other questions?
No, Justin.
This is Kevin Don?
Kevin, no.
Okay.
All right, this question comes from Kevin. Sorry. Important for Marx's Capital and how it was taken up subsequently in the Second International is the experience of the failures of the revolutions of 1848, the issues of democracy, Bonapartism, and the dictatorship of the proletariat, bridges the Paris manuscripts pre-1848 and the Grundrisse and Capital post-1848. This is downplayed at best and willfully neglected at worst by the New Left Marxology recoveries of Marx in figures such as Pistone, Nicolaus, etc., continuing in their successors in figures like Harvey and Heinrich today. With an eye towards the New Left's own conception of what it was trying to accomplish in its moment, how was this not merely a misrecognition on their part?
Well, I mean, one of the ways, this goes to the week before the race question, the gender sexuality, which is the neo-Marxism week, which is that what appealed about Marxism in Postone and Nicolaus' time was no longer this question of like, the kind of imagery that Marx and Engels depict in the 19th century of people working very hard and being thrown on the streets and then literally like zombie-like characters just walking around, without a home and without food or something like that as being expressions of the Industrial Revolution, but rather these questions of like, boredom and sort of nihilism and proletarian labor is like mechanical and degrading, it's not creative and free. And that's why the Grundrisse is playing the role that it is for the boomer generation who have, practical needs met, right? It's a period of affluence, right? It's a revolt against affluence. And so in that sense, we can say like, maybe the 1848 moment gets downplayed. Maybe it might have come back. But that's kind of the way in which Marx's critique was appealing to them. I mean, another thing I could say was something else I had in my presentation is in 2008, the big thing was not like the degradation of proletarian labor, but rather like the falling rate of profits. So Marxism becomes a crisis theory. There are blogs, crisis theory, right? What is the Marxist crisis theory versus the Austrian crisis theory? This kind of thing like that. And obviously that appealed to millennials because of the experience of the housing bubble and the financial crisis. And that was kind of in the air. Oh, it's a credit default swap. What's a, something like that, a securitized, mortgage-backed security or something like that. And so the parts of Marxism that appealed to millennials then became things like, the section I was just reading from. The reason I bring that up is because in Lenin and Luxemburg's time, I think Luxemburg has a nice little quote where she says, if you're going to wait for the falling rate of profit, you're going to wait for the sun to explode, right? Whereas like now, that's like the whole point of contention for this is why Marx is right or something like that. And in the mid-20th century, something like the falling rate of profit, I interviewed him, Shane Mage, then it became a question where it wasn't like waiting for a crisis, but the falling rate of profit was a reflection of the bureaucratization of society, that people were becoming government employees, and so they were no longer exploited. And so all of Marx's theory, if you look through the last century, it's changing its meaning at different times as different symptoms of the left are coming up. Now, go ahead.
I was just going to say about 1848 that I think for the New Left, 1848 gets refracted through 1917.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for this is because 1917, and this would have been, the self-conception of the radical Orthodox Marxists, was in a way a return to 1848, right? That's what Rosa Luxemburg says, we're returning to the Communist Manifesto, we're returning to the 1848 revolutions. And that's true. And I think that, you know, what Danny was trying to point out in his presentation about the difference between political economy before 1848 and after 1848 is important. Because before 1848, there was this sense that the proletariat basically could ally itself with radical bourgeois democracy and make the revolution through that alliance, and that it would be kind of the proletariat leading the bourgeois revolutions. And after 1848, the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, right, which is going to smash and replace the state, is, you know, the main contribution that Marx makes, and that's why Danny said that capital is about the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think, you know, there's a lot of different symptoms of this in the New Left. Somebody like Daniel Bell, Ralph Miliband. There's kind of this idea that in the 20th century, something's changed because we have this new big capitalist state, or, you know, because we have automation, and we don't have the pauperization of the 19th century, we don't have workers dying on the street, we don't need a revolution. And if you don't need a revolution, if you don't need the dictatorship of the proletariat, what's the point of the difference in political economy before and after 1848? There isn't one. And so, yeah, if you want to avoid the 1917 revolution, you know, ever happening again, then you should look to the early Marx, and you should read all of Marx in terms of, you know, early works on the Jewish question,
Which
whatever.
is how he's taught in courses. He's taught the selections from Das Kapital, selections from the 1844 manuscripts as completely to expunge any political dimensions of the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right, it's to show that he's like a humanist and not evil.
I mean, the way that 1848 comes up in the readings we do on the New Left is actually through the Spartacist League pamphlet, Lenin and the Vanguard Party.
I was going to say 1848 comes up today, but it's like, oh, Donald Trump is Louis Bonaparte? This is spell. You know, like that's the only way that people can return to it then. Yeah, what else was I going to say in terms, I don't know, do we have another question? Yeah.
So this kind of goes to what Aaron was saying. But in light of the 20th century, world revolutions of the Bonapartist state, specifically under the New Deal, in which the actual demands of the working class for the value of its labor were incorporated into the stability of the state. I mean, like specifically the Fordist state, and like in Europe we have like communist parties upholding capitalism, of course. Ultimately leading to what looks like the total death of socialism. What is actually left of Marx's capital that points beyond the impasse of bourgeois society? Does socialism still express the possibility to overcome capitalism? And I just wanted to add, I think this is an interesting debate because like you have, this came up recently with Doug Lane and Glenn Greenwald, where Glenn Greenwald said like, socialism just nowadays is like the demands that people make on the state.
Mm-hmm.
And then in that sense, like Tucker Carlson is a socialist at least as much as Bernie Sanders. And then you have Doug Lane saying, well, no, socialism's like this other thing. But maybe, if Glenn Greenwald is right and that socialism finds its apex in the Bonapartist state, then what is left of capital today? Like what is left of Marx's critique?
Right. So I guess I want to say two things, which is one that, when the state intervenes, it intervenes, we could say unconsciously, meaning it intervenes from a kind of, at best, the bourgeois horizon, a liberal horizon, meaning, I always say this when I read State and Revolution, Joe Biden is not going to say, oh, this is a class dictatorship or a class state. That's obviously a Marx point, whereas the dictatorship of the proletariat is going to say that. It's going to be conscious about the necessity of the state. Whereas what happens today is it's supposed to be representative of just the general will of the people, the legislators, something like that. In the 20th century as well, the Adorno we read Late Capitalism, so this goes to the Daniel Bell or Industrial Society. He says that Marx's, he says surplus value is becoming more and more difficult to observe. I don't know if it's observe or something maybe make sense of. And he says, on the one hand, this looks like a refutation of Marx. On the other hand, it's something that can be read out of Capital. right? Which is why I brought up Shane Mage earlier, meaning Shane Mage thinks he's giving a criticism of Marx, but you can actually say, well, Marx was also implying that there would be a removal of people from the exploitative industries and that everybody would be a Bed Bath & Beyond employee, right? The unproductive, this kind of thing like that. And so I guess the point that I'm bringing up in terms of Adorno is he's saying that to be actually true to Marx's critique of political economy, you would also have to get at, this is why we brought up Lenin and Luxemburg, how the laws are actually being transformed by the intervention of the proletariat. This is why I brought up the class point earlier, meaning the statization that happens, like the administered state, that's the work of the proletariat, right? That's the failure of socialism. They have to take responsibility for the authoritarian state, Horkheimer. And so these laws of political economy, because Marx already thinks the workers in their struggle are literally producing new categories, right? Relative surplus value comes right after chapter 10, the working day. The workers intervene as a class and they produce a new form of self-oppression, relative surplus value. So what Lenin and Luxemburg are trying to do is, okay, what's happened with the organization of the proletarian socialist movement under Marxism? That's the meaning of imperialism to them, right? And so in a sense, the political economy of the working class has developed further, not necessarily progress, but developed further. It's actually raised its own necessity or the possibility of it failing as well. And that's why Luxemburg and Lenin are like imperialism, imperialism, imperialism. And so really what would be necessary in order to like, I don't know, update capital, like this is kind of, I guess, sort of what these debates kind of come around, like, do we have to change this or that, is grasping the history of the left. But it's become very difficult to do such, right? Because in other words, it was the history of the class struggle that Marx is articulating in the development of political economy. It's, if you ever read, everyone's going to read Theories of Surplus Value after this, right? Because you're going to read all the Capital, and you're going to go and read that. And you go and you look at the sections, right? It's like Physiocrats and Adam Smith, that's part one. Ricardo, because he's the transitory character. And then it's the disintegration of Ricardianism and opposition to Ricardo on Ricardian theory, which Marx says comes about with communism and socialism. Meaning how the text is set up, the architectonic, is the bourgeois revolution, the crisis, the emergence of proletarian political economy, and that's the task, that's the way in which they've posed the question to themselves. Now, to the degree that an organized movement has liquidated itself, it's very hard to pick up on further developments in capitalism, except from any other, non-Marxist economists or sociologists. Like, they can still be of value, but it's really not the same thing. It doesn't have the same political import. So that's how I guess I would think of the New Deal. And, in a sense, someone like Mitchell, Dick Fraser, right, the race question that we read, in a sense that you could link that to the history of the critique of political economy. Because he's saying, look, these are conditions that have emerged with the New Deal, right? It's the liberal Dixiecrat alliance, and he's linking the Southern system to, the labor aristocrats in the North. So you can see that as, yeah, this was the intervention of the state and working class changed things, and that's still in the tradition of, the point of Marxist critique. Other questions? Yeah, we have plenty of time.
Who else has anything?
I'll just start reading things.
Yeah.
What's that?
You have to turn it on, yes.
Okay, so that brings out interesting points, I think, what you've been saying, because there's this, it strikes me that the difference between the new and the millennial left is pretty palpable. In terms of the left's actual capacity or desire to lead the discontents of society, because a lot of historiographical accounts of the new left will say that, Hal Draper was saying that there was a window of potential.
Mm-hmm.
That window closed, and then through the refusal of the new left to confront the legacy of historical Marxism. But that the millennial left, in a sense, never really even tried, because it was too busy kind of subordinating itself, if not only partially confronting this legacy of the new left. So you have, I think that's kind of what the Trump pedagogy seems to me intended to illustrate, is that the point of the left was to critically self-clarify new discontents in society, to understand what was actually new in the situation, how the conditions have changed, and that the millennial left never even confronted that task. So I guess with that in mind, my question is, well, is that in and of itself an expression of like the potential for overcoming the left, or is it like, I guess, how do you grasp the issue of overcoming the left when the left itself is so, I guess, quiet?
So I think I get the idea of the question, which is like, was there potential in the return to Marx in the millennial? Yeah, so I think Platypus in a way was kind of founded on the idea that there very well could have been, right? And maybe it's difficult to talk about now in 2021. And so even, when I said earlier that parts of Marx's critique were coming out for the millennials, that's not just to dismiss it, but that could have been an insight into like, oh yeah, let's return to this question, but seriously, right? This is when David Harvey's lectures on YouTube became very popular, and we can very, quickly see how that became like, it's really just the Democratic Party just through Marxist language, right? In other words, if you're going to say, I don't know, the workers exploited by their boss because Karl Marx proved so, then we need to support Bernie Sanders because he's going to give state funding to cooperatives. And so there's some kind of way, like this is why the DSA has capital reading groups or something like that. And the capital reading groups of today in the DSA are much different than they were in like 2009 or 2010, right? There's kind of a different point to them. Whereas today it's like proving that one is radical and militant, whereas then it was like, oh look, we can, be sort of like quasi-Keynesian. There's like this kind of weird kind of intermixture of like Marx is closer to Keynes, it's not Hayek, kind of thing like that, even though von Mises thought differently. So I've passed that quote around recently. And so in terms of the possibility, I think when I read Capital, I try to get people to reflect on what's missing and to be okay with maybe the distance of the text from the present. Meaning, this is something that I know we've all experienced. It's not unique to Capital. The imperialism pamphlet, right? Like, the kind of recent withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so the questions of imperialism are back on the table. It's like, yeah, what do we mean by what did Lenin mean by imperialism? We were just discussing this a few minutes ago. It's obviously not the same way in which people describe U.S. foreign policy in Afghanistan, or is China imperialist or they're not, or something like that. What's interesting to us is when people reach to try to justify this through Marx. And so, in terms of, I know this is a total question that I'm just going to throw something up in the air of what it would maybe look like to overcome, these problems. It would be to recognize them as baggage of history, right? In other words, to kind of grasp, oh, there was a necessary reason for reading Capital as like an economics text in the 2000s. And that was a consequence of a much broader history that I think I can link back to 100 years. That's kind of always been in there in the Second International, like Rudolf Hilferding or Nikolai Bukharin's responses to Bombark. But, Lenin and Luxemburg could bypass that because they were like, yeah, whatever, that's that person's idea. Whereas today, if you can grasp the distance of Capital, maybe that could raise the kind of a negative question on the present, the regression of the present. It could raise something critical. What's missing? What would be necessary to really grasp these texts in their full content? Okay.
Full content being political content, right?
Yeah, the critique.
The contradiction between bourgeois ideology and the bourgeoisie, which just means you get like that left Ricardianism or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so it's the political part that's left out of Marx that makes Marx different than just Ricardo or whatever.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say something that Danny often would point me to in Adorno is Adorno, I don't know what quote it is, but he talks about how the dialectic kind of breaks down in Capital, and those are the points where the text points beyond itself. As in, part of the point of Capital isn't just like, this is why bourgeois political economists don't fulfill their own demands, right? You could read it that way. You could read Capital as showing how the bourgeoisie doesn't live up to their own standards right? In terms of economics or politics or morality or whatever else. But part of the point of capital is also how, and Danny brought this up a moment ago, the proletariat creates new forms of domination and undermines its own form of organization, politically and socially. So, the end of the first volume of Capital is this like laundry list of different like groups and peoples in the proletariat. It's like, oh, I'm going to talk about Ireland for a bit, and I'm going to talk about these Welsh people and like, whatever. And it can be kind of confusing. Like, why is Marx suddenly, after giving this great theoretical exposition, telling me about like what the Irish workers are doing? And that's because the end is about the organization of the proletariat, right? And so when he talks about these different sections of the proletariat, it's about how can the proletariat, what does it mean for the proletariat to organize itself practically and politically as a class, in itself and for itself, and what new problems does that create? And so that's too what it means to say the political import of the text. It's not just that you should have this or that politics, but it's that the proletariat has to become conscious of how it's creating its conditions of domination and the conditions of politics and society. And that gets us to the point about imperialism. What is imperialism? It's a new form of domination created by the proletarian movement.
It's the crisis of the socialist movement.
Yeah. I mean, imperialism was the politics of parts of the socialist movement, right? There were parts of, the socialist movement, and they were called the social imperialists, who were advocating for imperialism as a way of ameliorating the problems of capitalism. And so Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin had to say, no, this is a new form of domination, right? And the dictatorship of the proletariat is necessary. This means that we have to turn the imperialist war into a civil war that leads to the international dictatorship of the proletariat. So that's kind of what it means to say, like, the political import. If that makes sense.
And also, like, I think Sunit quotes this in his article when he was on that panel on imperialism, that also the imperialism quasi looked like a dictatorship of the proletariat, because they had this idea that, okay, the proletariat's in the developed world, and so obviously they're going to have to lead, the kind of pre-capitalist working classes in the other worlds. This is kind of what Bernstein says. And so, there's also an idea of the workers' demands being realized through imperialism. I mean, if you read the Lenin pamphlet, there's a great quote where, he talks about somebody going to the East End, I forget who it is, who's just like, oh, in order to prevent a revolution at home, we need imperialism from abroad, because he's looking at poor and starving workers. So it's very much posing a straightforward question for them. Yeah, I mean, just one other thing I would say, in going back to Justin's question, is that when people, if you go to a Capital reading group today, and I've been to too many, and, someone's like describing chapter 1, and they go, okay, it's like use value, it's exchange value, and it's socially necessary labor time. All of these things are categories of contradiction, right? They're not like categories of just, this is a strong description or given by thought to itself is kind of the Proudhon way of describing it. But rather, they're defining themselves as a function of crisis. To even say socially necessary labor time, like, whereas, Adam Smith is just like labor, right? To really add those extra words in is to say, yeah, because there's a problem. You can't just say any labor. It has to be like a very definite quality and quantity.
It means that there's socially unnecessary.
Yeah, it means all this thing.
What the hell is that?
You know what I mean? But it's just kind of described where it's like, well, this is like the category, this is Marx's, this is what he means by crisis or something like that. And so I guess my point is everything he's saying, and this is why Spencer had suggested the perverseness of capital or something. Like, when he looks like he's just talking about flat economics, it's supposed to be scandalous, but we don't have that consciousness of Ricardianism or classical political economy to recognize this sort of scandalous character today, and it's just taken as fact. And so in a sense, it's a way of acclimating people to capitalism. Right? Like, oh, I go to work, Bed Bath & Beyond, surplus labor, yeah.
You actually just spoke to the question I was going to ask,
okay.
Which was why did Spencer suggest that title?
Yeah, and it's also that there are things as well, I'm not going to read the whole quote, centered around afterwards from Adorno, from his lectures on capital, where he's kind of like, it's frequently described in Capital that it's like, well, you start with something really simple, and then he's kind of building out the world. This is kind of a popular way of describing capital, and so you start with the commodity form, it's the cell form, which you can find in the Marxist writings, and therefore that's going to give you like the insight into describing every business cycle and how the economy is working. All those people at the Federal Reserve are idiots because they don't know this kind of view like that. And Adorno's like, it's actually not like that. Because what he's doing is he's giving the standpoint of the proletariat and then showing how when you build it out, it becomes more and more irrational. Right? And so, you know, I think the way that Lukács puts it, rationality at the micro level and irrationality at the macro level, meaning to the degree that you develop it, it becomes more and more an illusion, as Lukács puts it, right? When it's crystallizing into a theory, you're recognizing that what seems to be the theoretical unraveling of the world is actually ideology, and you're supposed to have a kind of epic moment of, oh, this is ideology, right? In other words, I just took this dialectic to its fullest limits, and I recognize the dialectic as insufficient, right, to really grasp the real potential of society. Right, it becomes a dialectic of capital. And, you know, so this is why, like, that would have had a practical effect on a proletarian socialist movement, because in a sense, it doesn't have to tell you the next step. It rather had to give an insight into the problem and the necessity for socialism, for proletarian socialism.
We have a couple more minutes.
Yeah.
Christine, are there any more questions online? None? Okay, anybody? Well, thanks, Danny.
Okay.
Okay, and our next event will be an interview with Jack Clark at 2 p.m. Oh, wait, before you end it, if you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe to our page. So that we have more followers on the internet. Okay, cool.
Yeah, click that bell, you'll get more content just like this.
Yes, I think 2 p.m. here for the Jack Clark interview.
On the DSA, the history of the 1970s and 80s left and the origins of the DSA, it'll be great.
Yeah, yeah.
We're gonna break for lunch.